Welcome back to Circus Core. I'm Nathaniel, and today I'm going to show you how to make these.
These are olive wood dice cut on my table saw and then sealed in resin. For an easier introduction to this challenge, I'd recommend starting with making the oversized wood icosahedron that I demonstrate here.
This is an intermediate woodworking project, but beginners who are patient enough to retry multiple times to get a worthy result are more than welcome to follow along.
Jumping right into it, we'll start with measuring the width of the slide channels on my table saw, and then cutting strips of 1/4 inch plywood to act as guides for our table saw sled. 1/4 inch is just a little too thick for them to fit in the channel properly, so I'll use my drum sander to thin them a bit. You can always sand them by hand as well, they don't need to be perfect. I'm just going to keep passing them through the sander until they fit nicely in the channel. I'll cut out the base for our sled of 1 inch plywood now. I went a bit overboard here, it really only needs to be wide enough to cover both channels. Then we'll cut a line down the middle, making sure not to cut all the way end to end. I'll cut a 2x4 the same length of the sled to make a handle of sorts for the sled, one for each end. Now we'll glue it all together. You can see how the guides slide in freely but don't have wiggle room. We'll place the wider ones in and lay a line of glue before placing the thinner ones atop, and then glue the top of that before gently placing the plywood base. Once that dries, we'll glue on the 2x4 handles perpendicular to the table saw cut. Set your miter saw to 21 degrees and cut the edge off a small block of scrap wood roughly 1/2 inch wide. Ignore the clamp being attached already. This was from my first attempt at the D20, which I didn't make large enough. We'll position the toggle clamp later, so please pretend it isn't there for now. Cut a 21 degree wedge off of a 2x4, as well as a larger block that will sit behind the wedge and hold the toggle clamps. Glue those down on the jig, leaving enough space for toggle clamps on the side. Those will be for the icosahedron. Set your miter saw to 31.5 degrees and we'll cut off another piece of scrap wood and glue it to our jig. Those will be for the Dodecahedron as well as both Pentagonal Trapezohedrons. Now we'll cut a very small piece at 20 degrees and another one at 30 degrees. Then place the 20 degree piece flat against the base of the 30 degree one and draw a line like so. We'll sand off the tip of the 30 degree one to the line, since cutting such a small piece will be difficult. Glue it down generously to the jig. This will be for the tetrahedron. Miter 2 pieces of scrap wood at 36 degrees and we'll keep both the block and the cutoff pieces. I'll take a D8 made from my mold and use it to line up this piece in such a way that this edge of the die lines up with this edge of the jig block, which is where the saw blade will be running. This piece will be going underneath the die, so I'll draw a line to sand down to just like we did with the D4 jig, so that it fits together nicely. Both of these are jigs for the Octahedron. One is for the first 4 cuts and the other is for the last set of 4 cuts. We'll use the D8 to make sure we position the smaller pieces perfectly while we glue it down. Now that we're done preparing the jig, it's finally time for cutting out the easiest die, the D6.
I'm making all of my dice slightly smaller than my resin molds. That way I can throw the wood blanks into the mold to easily seal them with resin.
After measuring the width of my D6, I'll adjust my fence so that it is ever so slightly smaller. Sanding will take that down a bit more, so you don't want to overdo it. After making the first cut, I'll use the miter gauge to cut off the live edge to make it easier to handle, and then cut the other side against the fence. I'll go about halfway through and then flip it around to finish the cut from the other side. That way I don't have to get my fingers close to the blade. And we'll use our miter gauge at 90 degrees to finish cutting the cube. I'll smooth it out with my orbital sander at 120 grit and use it to apply bevels to match my D6 mold. Now moving on to the most difficult one, the D20. Since my wood isn't quite thick enough to make a cube big enough,
I'll cut 2 pieces at the thickness of the board and glue them together. To make this look cleaner, I'll mirror the wood. I'll pass that through the saw again to cut off the excess glue and use a miter gauge to cut off the live edge. Then I'll measure the width between these 2 points on an icosahedron from my mold and set our fence to be just a bit less than that. Then we'll cut a cube out of this just like we did before. Draw a line down the middle of one of the faces of the cube, and then rotate the cube to draw another line perpendicular to the first one. Continue until all of the faces have lines which are perpendicular to the lines on all adjacent faces, like so. You can measure where the halfway point is, but I prefer to just eyeball it. Place the D20 cube so that a pencil line is in line with where the saw blade will pass through, and set the toggle clamp head so that it applies firm pressure on the D20 cube, but not so tight that it tears apart the jig. Cut slowly and carefully. Even for an advanced woodworker, rushing any of these steps will make an unusable result. I cut out a couple of pieces of scrap wood at 21 degrees to act as support for the former cube while cutting. After 12 careful cuts, it should look like this. Since we erred on the side of caution and undercut, it won't look perfect until we're done sanding. Be careful not to oversand or mess up the angles. If you're cautious, it should now look like this. Now we'll draw equilateral triangles on each of the faces, allowing the longest side of each pentagon to be one of the sides of the triangle. It's best to think of this dodecahedron in terms of 6 pentagonal pairs wrapping around each other. I'll get an idea for positioning the toggle clamps with the D20 dodecahedron in place on this part of the jig. Bear in mind, we'll be cutting off this shortened pyramid shape. We want the toggle clamps to apply pressure at the center of mass for the dodecahedron, directly opposing each other, and of course, not in the path of the blade. Once we get that right, we'll screw them in and tighten the toggles to the optimal pressure to hold the dodecahedron in place. We'll line up and clamp down our dodecahedron and start turning it into an icosahedron. You'll have to do a lot of finagling to get the right one to cut. Just make sure when you put it into position that the pencil line is perfectly parallel to the saw blade. If it isn't, you probably just have the dodecahedron at the wrong angle. Rotate it around until it looks just right. Eventually, it will look like this. Not perfect since we erred on the side of caution, but sanding will bring out the proper shape. I'm going to finish sanding with my orbital sander at 120 grit, which is less aggressive than my belt sander. Now we'll move on to the D4. First, I'll cut out another cube the same size as what we used for the D20. Draw an outline of the base of your D4 on the block. Now we'll actually hot glue this block to the jig for cutting, making sure to line up the blade with our pencil lines. Yes, we are really stretching the definition of jig here, but if it works, it works. Since the D4 has such acute angles, there's really nowhere for the toggle clamps to get a good grip. In order to give me more room to cut material, I'm actually going to angle my saw blade and raise it into my plywood jig base a few times, increasing the angle each time. This will let me cut all the way to the line of the D4 in one go. Alternatively, you could have elevated the block earlier, but such is the penalty for winging it instead of planning things out beforehand. I find the best result if I only wait a few seconds after applying the hot glue before cutting. You don't want it to be so fluid that it doesn't hold the D4, but it's best if it's not fully hard, else it will be hard to remove the D4 between cuts. After 3 careful cuts, we'll sand it down to perfection, making sure to sand in bevels to match my D4 mold.
Now on to the D12. When I first tried making a D12,
I had trouble getting it quite right because I wasn't visualizing it properly.
I was thinking about it as a pentagonal crown with 5 pentagons hanging off of it and then duplicated and mirrored.
I made a jig for this vision initially, but it took a lot of effort to get it just right. So I reframed my thinking to instead think of it as
6 pentagonal pairs wrapped around each other. When I did that, it became infinitely easier to make it a reality. Share with me in this lesson I learned.
sometimes when you're trying to make an idea a reality, how you conceptualize it can make a world of difference. Don't get hung up on one way of thinking about something, or you will limit your creativity.
I'll measure the distance between these 2 points on my D12 and set my fence to that width to make another cube. Just like we did when we were making a dodecahedron for the icosahedron, we'll draw a line down the middle of a face and then rotate it so that we can draw another line down the middle of an adjacent face that will run perpendicularly to the first line. Keep repeating until every face has a line down the middle that will be perpendicular to the faces adjacent to it. Position the block on the jig so that the blade is just outside of our pencil cut lines, and screw the toggle clamp into place so that it applies pressure at the center of the D12 cube, but out of the way of the blade. And tighten the toggle to the appropriate pressure. Now we can begin cutting. I saved a couple pieces of 31.5 degree scrap wood to stabilize the dodecahedron during cutting. The only difference between the dodecahedron for the D12 and the one we made earlier for the icosahedron is the angles. This one will be what we call a regular dodecahedron, meaning that all angles on it are identical. After we're done cutting, we'll sand it down just like the others. Now for the D10s. This one gave me a bit of trouble at first as well, until I thought of them as dodecahedrons with their crowns elongated to a point. So I'll cut out 2 cubes the same size as what I used for the D20. They need to be as long or longer than the D10s end to end. And then we'll draw on the lines just as if we were making a regular dodecahedron. Since this is larger than our regular dodecahedron, we'll need to adjust our toggle clamp in the D12 section of our jig so that we don't tear it apart. I had to cut a few sides before I could figure out which sides needed to not be cut. Before you cut, go ahead and X out 1/2 of one of the faces, as well as the opposite half of the opposite face. These 2 cuts will be skipped. All of these steps heretofore for one of the D10s can be repeated exactly for the other D10. Even though mine have different angles, we'll give them their angles in the next step. As you can see, it looks pretty terrible so far, so you absolutely have to trust the process here and not rush it. Sanding is where these will come into their true form. As unreliable as this may sound, this has proven to be the most effective and easiest method to get these right. Compare regularly to a D10 out of your mold, and do your best to match the angle. The most important part here is to match the angle as best you can, and then stick with it for every side. Trust the process and it should turn out something like this. Following the previous steps, the only thing I'll change for this D10 is the angle I sand at. Now for the final die, the D8. We'll need a rectangular prism as long and as wide as the D8. Fortunately, the D20 cube is as long as the D8, so I just have to shave off 2 sides for the width. I'll measure and draw a line for that, set my fence, and then cut. Draw lines across the middle of the 4 long faces and position them in the jig so that the blade will cut from the center of the top small face through to the pencil line. Center and secure the toggle clamp and we can begin the first 4 cuts. The other half of the D8 jig is designed to nestle the first half of the D8 after it has been cut. Secure the toggle clamp and then we'll make the last 4 cuts. By now you know the drill, sand to perfection. Having completed cutting and sanding all of the dice, brush out as much dust as possible from the wood. It will cloud our resin finish if it remains. If you are wiser than I, you would use a rag to finish cleaning it off. You might notice that these dice don't look 100% perfect. I left some minor defects / askewedness by rushing a little bit, in order to experiment and see how well the resin will cover those minor defects. I think you'll be pleased by the result, as well as comforted with the knowledge that it doesn't have to be 100% perfect. 96% perfect will do just fine and won't even be noticeable. If you are more of a perfectionist, more caution and patience will allow you to get the result you desire. I'll mix up 42 grams of resin. Since I'm mixing by weight instead of volume, that'll be 23 grams of part A, resin, and 19 grams of part B, hardener. But of course, follow the recommendation of your particular resin. After thoroughly mixing it, I'll pour it straight into my mold. Since these are only going to be coating the wood, there doesn't need to be much in the mold. Just make sure there's enough for the wood dice to be fully covered and still have some excess resin sitting on top of the mold. 1/4 to 1/3 of the way full should be just fine. You'll notice how when I push the dice in, a decent amount of resin is pushed out. This is what we want to ensure there are no voids in the finish. You will need to wear gloves since this is going to be quite messy. I'll lay my mold lid down gently and firmly and then place it in my pressure pot on parchment paper. Weigh it down amply and screw the lid down tightly in a repeating X pattern. Set it to 40 psi and leave it for 23 hours. After depressurizing, it is time to demold. And hoo-wee! Let me tell you, these turned out beautifully. Some of the edges aren't quite perfect, so I'm going to sand off those specific edges a bit. I'll start at 240 grit, move up to 400 grit, and then through the Zona papers. Now I'll ink in the numbers using some silver acrylic paint. Gently wipe off the excess with a hot wet rag. I'll get a few faces at a time for each die and then let it dry for about an hour before moving on to paint another few faces. Once I'm satisfied with the numbers, I'll rub off the excess paint with a rag soaked in isopropyl alcohol. If you liked this video, let me know what you'd like to see next. Also, be sure to check out our freshly released Patreon. There you can vote to decide our next video, have access to major discounts, and so much more. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.